and I'd like to introduce
This meeting is being recorded.
Camille Heron, our moderator for this evening's event. Camille?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So for this event, we're going to have 15 minutes for each speaker to present their materials, their expertise. And as Sarah said, we are going to have a panel discussion at the end with Q&A from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker so we can get started because they don't have a lot of time to present. So our first speaker is Yael Bromberg. She is the Chief Counsel for the Andrew Goodman Foundation.
Hi, folks. Good evening. It's a pleasure to join you all and to join We the People, or rather the people, who's working on behalf of We the People. And I see my friends here, one of my big inspirations, Katie Fahey, joining. So really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to share with you a little bit of my perspective of the current landscape with regard to youth voting rights, and also offer a framework for thinking about the youth vote and youth voting rights in general, one that's largely overlooked and underappreciated. And I'm going to provide it to us within a contemporary lens. And I know that my co-panelists, Professor Jennifer Frost, who just published a really wonderful new book, will provide more of the historical backdrop behind all of this. And so let me just kick off my screen share. Okay, can you guys see my screen here? Okay, great. So I have to start with what the 26th Amendment is, because usually you just launch into it and people don't remember. It's an amendment that was ratified in 1971. So we're in the 50th anniversary year since this ratification. And what it did was outlaw age discrimination with regard to access to the ballot and lower the voting age from 21 to 18. People that were around at the time may remember being in the streets and protesting, and Professor Frost will talk a lot about that. But there's a reason why people today, even those that were actually in the streets protesting, don't remember what this amendment is or what the right was, and why we haven't evolved to appreciate this specific group as a protected class from a constitutional perspective. And what I found through working with young people and litigating around this and developing kind of organizing policy litigation around this amendment is that it's actually a really powerful tool to remember what the promise is of the 26th Amendment when youth voting rates are at an unprecedented rate, right? We had historic national voter turnout in 2020 that tracked for youth voters as well, the first election in which the majority of people under the age of 30 participated in US history in access to the ballot. And yet, there continues to be a threat to their access for this protected class. So it was the 26th Amendment was an integral part and natural expansion of the Second Reconstruction. I'm not going to focus too much about this because I know Professor Frost wrote a book on it. But from the vantage point of where I sit with the Andrew Goodman Foundation as Chief Counsel and Strategic Advisor, what I will offer was that this amendment came about through a movement of youth leadership during the Second Reconstruction. And it's often forgotten that it's thought of kind of like as an afterthought, like, oh, and then, 1971 hit and, 1960s were over, and, we just like hang the hat on passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or the Civil Rights Act of 1969. But actually youth leadership this was a continuum where young people turned to themselves to enfranchise themselves. And of course, this is, I look at the legacy of the origin of the Andrew Goodman Foundation as well, the assassination of three young men that
I don't.
participated in
Hey,
Freedom
David
Summer.
Goodman.
Oh, I see that we have David Goodman, who is Andy's brother, joining us. Hi, David.
Hello.
Um, and so there was all of these efforts and examples of youth leadership. And again, I don't want to focus too much on this because I know that Professor Frost will get into it. And then we come to ratification, which basically it passed the Senate unanimously. Hard to imagine that today. And the House nearly unanimously. And in record time, it went through the 38 requisite states to be ratified into the US Constitution in less than 100 days. Quickest amendment to be ratified in US history. And what I really like to focus on when I talk about youth voting rights today is this language within the Senate report of the 26th Amendment. This is the report that accompanied the amendment as it went for ratification through the states that Congress agreed on to inform it in ratifying. And what it found was that forcing young voters to undertake special burdens, obtaining absentee ballots, or traveling to one centralized location in each city, for example, in order to exercise their right to vote might well serve to dissuade them from participating in the election. And the quote goes on, and it offers that, and also serves as may be a violation of the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. So this contemplates the 26th Amendment within a continuum.
Right?
Within a continuum from the 14th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. And it provides us specific examples of what special burdens look like and why we have ratified the amendment, right? It says outsized reliance by young people to vote by mail. Why? Because the elections were scheduled when young people were on, the primaries, for example, are scheduled when young people are not at their campus domicile, right? And city council elections had been scheduled during spring break when the students were away. And so this was kind of responsive to those general trends and tried to provide that example of, no, we actually have to allow them to participate. And also it offers this other specific example. Obviously, it's a not inclusive list. And it says, or traveling to one centralized location in each city. This means off-campus polling locations, right? And at the Andrew Goodman Foundation, we're doing a huge effort right now to popularize bringing polling places on campuses. We found that youth voting rates really impressively increase, no surprise, when polling stations are where young people sleep, live, eat, study, work, etc. And so these were contemplated within the Senate report, and we still see these issues coming up again today. And so this is the unfulfilled promise, and this is kind of the legacy. 50 years later, the class continues to be unrecognized in general by the courts. We have to do a lot of popular education around this. And what I found is that when I speak with young voters, they independently recognize, oh, yeah, I had an issue with my voter registration form. My provisional ballot, I had to vote provisionally, but they don't see it within a systemic lens of a protected constitutional right. And when we provide it within that systemic lens, it removes the onus from the individual, right? It's not just, your college age student that had an issue because they didn't do something correctly, right? Or a feeling of personal guilt, right? Oh, I didn't do that correctly. That's my fault. Like, I'm to blame. No, this is actually a part of a wider system that we have yet to provide institutional remedies for. And these are some of the examples of special burdens, right? The Senate report contemplates special burdens when they talk about access to the ballot for young people. And what we're seeing in the field at the Andrew Goodman Foundation, this is just some examples. So for example, there are pressures by the states that they tell young people, they provide them misinformation, actually disinformation because it's intentional, to tell them that they can't vote from their campus domicile, right? But in 1979, the Supreme Court upheld the right for students to vote from their campus domicile, and also said that you can't exact a specific questionnaire to young people that you don't provide to other people, right? You can't start to ask young people, fill out this questionnaire, where do your parents live? Where's your intention to live in 3 years, et cetera, et cetera, when you're not equally applying that standard to all other voters. And of course, we live in an increased mobile society. Adults beyond the age of 18, like the older generations, they might have dual dwelling units, they might have a vacation house. These questions are not equally applied to them. And so why would we exact them to young people? Additionally, strict voter identification. Many of the states that require strict voter ID, for example, student voter identification is not included. And when it is included, they're not allowed to provide, sometimes it can be that you offer only a public school ID, but not a private school ID. Well, guess what? These are all accredited institutions. The students have had to prove their identity by being accepted into these schools. They have to go through FAFSA, federal aid. There's endless applications and identity checks. Nobody's going to school on false pretense of false identity. That's how they secure these identification forms. And if you target only, and if you only allow the public schools, then the private schools that are additionally kind of thrown under the bus include HBCUs, meaning historically Black colleges and universities. And then you have specific examples of not only age discrimination, but age coupled with race discrimination. And so this issue about accessibility, including student ID within permissible voter identification, really manifests strongly. I'll give you another example. In Wisconsin, they allow student IDs to vote, but only if the student ID is only 2 years old. And otherwise it's deemed to be expired, even though that expectation is not put on other forms of identification. Well, there's 300,000 students in colleges across Wisconsin. When we look at election margins, right, we're a nonprofit, right? We do our work from a nonprofit lens. However, the youth vote is a specific protected class, and we see that their impact has actually electorally significant margins when we focus on the ways in which this specific class is targeted. 2016, I believe it was 23,000 votes, the vote margin for the federal election 2016, 23,000. We're talking about 300,000 young people across the state of Wisconsin. Polling locations. So I'm trying to go quickly because I want to be sensitive for time here. But polling places, as I said, we're doing a big push to popularize on-campus polling locations. We had to sue the state of Florida in 2018, leading up to the 2018 general election. There, the Secretary of State put an outright ban saying you cannot put polling places on campuses during the early voting period. We litigate, first of all, wow. Second, we litigated based on the 26th Amendment and established new precedent in this current era of jurisprudence to protect access to the ballot for young people based on the 26th Amendment. We overturned that ban, and the judge put the preliminary injunction in place in August 2018. By November 2018, 3 months later, 12 polling places were brought onto campuses during the early voting period. And then later we went to quantify who took advantage of those polling locations. What we found was 60,000 voters, primarily youth, but also across age groups, because it was serving the faculty and the employees associated with institutions of higher education, availed themselves of those on-campus polling locations. And again, if you look at the electoral margin 2018 for the Senate race and the gubernatorial race in Florida, those elections, those are hugely significant electoral margins based on this very precise election mechanism that protects a protected class. And I've been working this semester with students at the Harvard Kennedy School's William Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice. And we've been studying 12 examples in which our campuses within the Andrew Goodman Foundation network have successfully brought polling places on campuses. So we can study them as case studies and share those tools out as best practices to learn through this process, because sometimes you need the litigation. Like I also litigated on behalf of Bard College in, Democratic-led upstate New York, and we had to litigate to bring a polling place on campus. And through that litigation, 2 years of separate litigation efforts, we directly caused the inspiration for statewide impacts. So they recently, within the New York budget, they put in the budget an amendment to the election law to mandate putting polling places on campuses across the state of New York, which is incredible. And it was based on the litigation, but it's not always litigation. Oftentimes it's organizing, and it's just bringing the students with the local officials. And we see a huge impact just by that. And the institutions of higher education support this because it's within their civic mission, to be civic actors. So I just want to kind of fast forward a little bit. And also when we look at the reliance, outsized reliance on provisional ballots, after the 2016 race, there was an analysis of provisional ballots are the last line of defense, right? Your voter registration didn't go through, something happens in the process, and then you're forced to vote provisionally. Well, if we look at the rates of reliance on provisional ballots, it gives us an indication in terms of that there's a systemic problem in place, specifically based on age cohort. And 25% of young people reported that they had to vote provisionally in the 2016 election, compared to 6% of baby boomers and 3% of members of the greatest generation. So that means something happened along the way, and that young people specifically, there's systemic problems with regard to them. Now, if you look at the treatment of those provisional ballots, their outsized rejection rates by young people, which is remarkable. So in the Florida case, for example, what we found was provisional ballots cast by young people 4 times more likely to be rejected compared to other age cohorts. And again, this gets us to the electoral margins. And so there's so many pieces here, like campus gerrymandering and things of that nature. But what I want to really shed to you and offer to you is that this is a new way to examine systemic voter suppression of a class. And it's sometimes intentional and sometimes unintentional, but there are methods to work around this that include bringing together strategic organizing, advocacy, legal relief only when necessary. And again, the law is not always the way that litigation is not always the way to go. A lot of times people want to do this. They want to make sure that youth voters are protected. With regard to the 26th Amendment, what I want to offer is that because it's such a new amendment, because it's such an under-litigated amendment, an under-known amendment, that the future of it is unwritten, and that we are in the process of writing it now and making it popularized. So I really want to thank the people for your leadership and for offering a space for us to examine this amendment and offer some public education, both in terms of its contemporary lens, but also with regard to its historical lens. And the last points I want to offer is just some context in terms of the current youth vote. So in the 2018 midterm, we saw a 10% increase of youth voters compared to 2016. It was the highest turnout rate in 25 years. That was 2018. So we were leading into this pandemic electoral crisis from already unprecedented rates of youth engagement. And then in the midst of a pandemic, what we saw was 50% of young people participated and voted. And when you look at the voting rates of students specifically, the rates are 69%. And why was that? Yes. And why was that? It's because we availed ourselves in the midst of a pandemic, oftentimes, of election modernization tools, right? We offered expanded access to vote by mail. We offered expanded access to online voter registration, to updating your address information to be able to do that online, through even emailing. There were so many ways in which we were strategic as a nation to respond to the electoral crisis. And I have a lot of hope there. And I have a lot of hope from a cross-partisan and nonpartisan perspective, because what it tells me is that people understand what it means and what it looks like to modernize our election systems, that they want to vote by mail. Like, we had unprecedented reliance on vote by mail, and it took a learning, to get to that point, but that was something that was done across age cohorts. And what it means is people want increased reliance, and that we are starting to have an expectation that our electoral systems match where our technology is, and that if we don't want to work on these kind of 19th century tools for the century that we actually live in today, especially when, I have a student that I represented. He was this president of the student government at Rutgers University. And he said in one of the pieces to the media, he said, I can check my phone. I could check my GPS immediately on my phone. Why can't they validate my identity at the polls or within the period in which they're checking the votes? And that's exactly right. We have to match our election modernization for the system that we're at today. And one of the reasons that I have a lot of hope around working with youth voters and young people in general and talking about the 26th Amendment is because of its cross-partisan history. It was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. It was championed by Dwight Eisenhower during his 1954 State of the Union, championed by Barry Goldwater. It has this incredible cross-partisan history. And what I found is that people don't want their children, like when you're talking about older voters, they don't want their children to suffer voter suppression, right? Or unnecessary obstacles with regard to access to the ballot. And a part of that is because we all experience, God willing, aging and being young once. And so I have a lot of hope that if we focus on youth voters, that we can start to kind of bridge the gap between the two and just like focus on the question about voting for the protection of our future. And I really do believe that that's something that hopefully we can continue to bring together, especially in our hyper-polarized political climate.
Thank you, Yael. Our next speaker is Jennifer Frost. She is the author of Let Us Vote. I'm going to go ahead and pass the floor to you, Jennifer.
Let's see. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Somehow I've lost my video, so I don't know. I was there with. Okay, so okay, let me try to share my screen and see if that works. But all of a sudden, it's all not working, and I don't know because it was working perfectly earlier. Okay, let me just try this. Okay, I'm sorry. We were doing this right. Yeah, it's not letting me share my screen. It's saying it's not happy with me somehow. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
And we can also
apologies,
see you.
everybody. I got a new computer and it just, I don't know, it was doing fine and now it's not. So I don't know if you can see me, but I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for that. Just really inspiring to think about what's happening now and the way in which this amendment has so much promise for the future, and that just really makes me very happy. So just quickly, I'm Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm coming to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm a U.S. historian who has been working on the 1960s for quite a long time, and I always tell my students that I have been teaching a course on the 1960s, and only in 2014 did I include the 26th Amendment in the legacies of the 60s. So I'm one of those historians who hadn't paid attention to the 26th Amendment, and obviously that's changed now. So we already heard from Yael what the 26th Amendment does, and I think this point that it's the last time the US significantly expanded voting rights is a good point to make. Now, as a historian, one of the things we do is we look at how historical events or developments have been interpreted in the past. And one of the things that was quite striking, and I think, contributes to this idea that the 26th Amendment is sort of the forgotten amendment, is that there was only one history of the amendment and how it came about before I wrote my book. So now there's two full-length books on this. So we definitely need more scholarship on this, absolutely. And also you can look at the people who did write about it, mainly in articles or PhD dissertations, is that we get some misinterpretations of the movement, that either it was primarily a top-down event or that it was already a foregone conclusion. Probably my favorite, if I can say it that way, of the misinterpretations is from a political theorist who said the amendment was not sought by and was of no interest whatsoever to the 18-year-olds to whom it granted the vote. And I have to say, when I read that quote, that's when I was absolutely determined to write this history of the 26th Amendment, how it came about, and specifically the youth franchise movement that succeeded in doing this. So just really quickly, my book and its arguments. So I cover a 30-year time period from 1941 to 1971. And I talk about the movement developing over three phases. So first, the 1940s and 1950s, where you have a few people, prominent people and organizations pushing for youth voting rights. And then in the 1960s, it really exponentially grows, and we see efforts all over the United States. But it's in the third phase that I think is quite exciting, 69 to 71. I call it sort of the turn of the 70s. And you see a quick succession of events that leads to success, but propelling all of this is a national youth franchise movement. So my book is really trying to trace that evolution and building of a momentum and movement to lower the voting age to 18. And one of the reminders I like to give to my students is that historical change takes time, and you can see here it's a 30-year movement, which is actually half the time the women's suffrage movement had to organize to get women the right to vote. So historical change could take time, but it also then can come very quickly. And I think that's one of the lessons of my book, the historical lessons of my book, is that, having all the people in place and working over time and, having defeats, but getting up and dusting themselves off and getting back to it is just absolutely important, because you don't know when the opportunity is going to arise where change can really be achieved. And I think that's part of the story here of the youth franchise movement and the 26th Amendment. In terms of the chronology, there's no doubt the 60s are crucial. And it's crucial for a lot of reasons, but I would say most fundamentally, of course, it's the movement for African-American civil and voting rights. And I make the strong claim, but I think it's pretty convincing, that, without African-American civil and voting rights, no youth franchise, right? No 18-year-old vote. And so understanding that context is, of course, so important. And then, in addition to thinking about just the structure of the book or the story it tells, is also the arguments I make, which is that we need to understand this achievement as a result of a long movement, so over 30 years. We need to think about the interaction between top-down and bottom-up forces, that you need students and people in communities organizing and putting pressure on politicians at all levels of government. But you also do need top-down initiative. I mean, it is necessary to have a president who will sign off on legislation. It is necessary to have senators and Congress, members of Congress who are going to push for this kind of legislation. So you need both bottom-up and top-down forces coming together. I think the other exciting aspect of the youth franchise movement and the achievement of the 26th Amendment is that it was a broad and bipartisan, and you can see I've highlighted here bipartisan, coalition worked together to achieve the 26th Amendment. And, Yael just showed us those statistics on, a unanimous Senate and a mostly unanimous House of Representatives supporting the 26th Amendment. This is a time where the parties aren't as politically polarized as today. And part of the reason I wanted to tell this story is just to show that, yes, Republicans and Democrats worked on the same side to expand voting rights. And not that long ago, within our memories and of many of us. And I think just a good, again, historical lesson to remember. Another argument that I make in the book is that all of the proponents for youth voting rights, they articulated numerous arguments in favor of lowering the voting age. I mean, the initial one, the one I call the foundational argument, was called old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So it was linking the draft age of 18 to the voting age and saying, if we're going to draft young men at that point in time during World War II to fight and possibly die in battle, then they should certainly have the right to vote for the politicians, the leaders who send them into battle. And that was the foundational argument. But right away, and then all through time, there were arguments about young people's education and maturity and the fact that they were fulfilling all sorts of responsibilities of citizenship. They should get the full rights of citizenship. And I think one thing that was smart about the numerous arguments is that, people need different entrees into movements. They need different reasons to, kind of come around to agreeing with you or taking a position. And only having one argument isn't as kind of convincing. Having multiple arguments that might ring true for different people in different ways, I think was really important. And then they pursued a range of strategies. They were flexible in their strategies, took advantage of every opportunity. So whether it was legislation at the state or federal level, or if it was litigation, so going to court to try to lower the voting age, using the initiative in some states like Oregon and California, and of course, organizing and building up all sorts of momentum so that when legislation was pending in a state or in Congress, you could have people petitioning and calling and coming along. And so what I argue is that this multiplicity made the movement, that often we think that multiplicity undermines or fragments movements. This is a great example where multiplicity made the movement. It made the movement accessible to lots of different people. Like I said, they could find different ways to enter and contribute, but also the movement being flexible meant that it was able to take advantage of historic opportunities and make them work. So I think we have a good historical lesson here about our current movements and political efforts, which I think is one of the reasons why I love the history of this movement, but I also like sharing it with it because I think there are lessons for us going forward too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So do we have any questions for our panel?
And feel free if you want to pull yourself off mute to ask or drop it in the chat.
Actually, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So in looking at your PowerPoint, Yael, I was interested in the campus gerrymandering, which you didn't get a chance to talk about. Could you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. So what I found with when I look at, when I look at the situation of polling locations, what I found was that students are actually oftentimes sent to different polling locations based on where they live. And to me, this is a potential, not always, but a potential red flag of a campus gerrymander, depending on the specific electoral district that we're examining, but especially on the local level. And there's never been so the 26th Amendment cases in the 1970s, there were many of them. But in the modern era, there's very few. And there's never been a 26th Amendment case brought around a campus gerrymander specifically. And so this is really an under-examined, I mean, the 26th Amendment in general is under-examined. Conceptualizing these voters as a protected class is, I don't want to say it's new because the 26th Amendment contemplated it, but the popular education around it is new because it's what I call the forgotten amendment. So all of that is to say is that this is a very under-examined focus, and understanding this question of campus gerrymanders. And I'll give you an example, a concrete example. So North Carolina A&T University, which is the largest HBCU in the nation, also huge, obviously based in North Carolina, hugely historically significant. The Woolworth counter sit-in was started by four North Carolina A&T students, thereby kicking off the desegregation lunch counter sit-ins through the 1960s when they took the lunch counter at Woolworth in February 1964. And North Carolina A&T, in just within the last decade, has been home to a direct gerrymander where if you walk down one of the main roads, the main avenue on campus, the students on one hand were part of one congressional district, and the students on another hand were part of a second congressional district. So therefore, the youth vote specifically was cracked and split. And my suspicion is that because we haven't popularized this issue about on-campus polling locations, that we haven't really studied the prevalence of on-campus gerrymanders. But I do know through the stories that start to come up through my network at the Andrew Goodman Foundation that the students start to describe, oh yeah, when we look at the polling place, we're sent here, the other ones are sent here. There's they literally cross paths on campus to go to different polling locations. Well, the reason for that is because there's election units that are drawn through the campuses. It's the only possible explanation for it. And in many of these states, what'll happen if you go to the wrong polling location in 22 states in the nation, which they won't tell you is kind of underappreciated, is that the provisional ballot that's cast outside of the correct election unit is actually the entire thing is tossed. So even though there might be statewide seats on that ballot that obviously you're still eligible to vote for, maybe not that specific local race, but the statewide race, the entire thing is just thrown out. So this is another reason why there's an outside result. To explain the outsized reliance on voting provisionally by young people and the outsized rejection rate of that particular group.
We have a question. Oh. I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody.
Oh, that was me, Camille. Is that Camille?
Yeah, I was just reading a question in the chat, but you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question for Yael. It seems to me that all the new restrictions and the challenges and the obstacles to voting that have been enacted since 2020 are particularly potentially damaging to young voters exactly because they don't have, by definition, the long history of voting and the commitment to voting is part of their life and so on. And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that that's a issue that we see across partisanship. I think it's really easy to look at the traditional kind of Republican-led states and say, oh, this is where these legislative efforts are coming from. But I absolutely agree with that, Mike, that even in the blue states, we should be seeing more expansive leadership around youth voting. For example, popularization of election day registration, online voter registration, OVR, also online voter registration, which doesn't necessarily rely on having to provide an in-state driver license, because that by definition will impact certain groups of youth voters, including out-of-state students who don't want to get a new driver license just because they went to school elsewhere. So I absolutely agree with that, Mike. And forgive me if I didn't focus on the current legislative trends, which are also unprecedented, that in response to historical voter turnout by young people and by voters at large through election modernization that was in place as a temporary fix during the pandemic, that in response to that historic turnout, we've also seen a historic introduction of restrictive proposed and passed bills on the state level.
And just one more comment. Very proud that as the people, and Kathy Stewart, who also has a question, we're working with her at the time, we championed the Vote at Home, the programs by the Vote at Home Institute. And I think that the opportunities for young voters and others, obviously everybody, to vote by mail and have more time to concentrate and do that, as well as obviously for it to be more safe and convenient. I think that was a big factor. And I think the challenges to that ability to vote by mail are potentially as damaging as anything.
Absolutely, I'm with you. And I see my colleague Phil Kiesling here, and I also want to at least recognize, I see Charlie Gonzalez here, who is very important to the ratification of the 26th Amendment, and David Goodman, who I acknowledged earlier, Andy's late brother, and former president and board chair for the Andrew Goodman Foundation. And I agree. I mean, I was talking to Phil about this earlier, actually, that, there are 7 states in the nation that directly restrict availability to vote by mail expressly on account of age. That they say that if you're over the age of 60 or over the age of 65, then you can vote by mail without providing an excuse. But if you're under those ages, you cannot vote by mail without an excuse. And that in many of these states, the pandemic was not an excuse. Being a part of a vulnerable medical condition or living with immunocompromised individuals in your family was not an excuse. And so there were challenges that were brought, principled on the 26th Amendment, out of Texas and out of Indiana, which was the state of the late Senator Birch Bayh, who championed the 26th Amendment's ratification, along with other very necessary constitutional amendments during that time period, and Title IX, and the list goes on in terms of his leadership. But he would be appalled to know that Indiana cuts access to vote by mail on account of age. And those were cases that were brought out of Texas and Indiana that went up through the federal courts, and the Supreme Court ultimately denied review and effectively let stand the decision out of Texas, which says, actually, it's kind of a remarkable decision if you look at it. The Fifth Circuit ruled on it. The district court judge out of Texas found that there was a violation of the 26th Amendment. It had very strong language around that. Then the Fifth Circuit panel found that there wasn't, and had some extraordinarily restrictive and radical ideas. And then that decision was actually too out of line and out of step. And there was a new Fifth Circuit panel that basically erased the prior Fifth Circuit decision, but still put in really radical and out of step legal reasoning to support this, what we call constitutional prima facie discrimination on its face. It's so obvious, you just see it. There's an age cutoff. And what the reasoning is really remarkable. And what it says is basically that because vote by mail was not available at the time of 1971 when the amendment was ratified, therefore the right to vote cannot be accessible pursuant to vote by mail for the youth class. by extension, yes, everyone's jaws should be dropping because by extension, vote what the assumption, the implication is that vote by mail is not a protected under the right to vote. That's directly, and this is at a time when unprecedented people voted by mail in this election, including young people and including Republicans and across the party lines of all age cohorts. And so that's really what they're saying, and that's their offer to restrict access to the 26th Amendment, is to say that it doesn't extend to voting by mail, which is really incredible. And it went up to the Supreme Court. Scottus denied cert. Justice Sotomayor said, this has yet to be litigated, so it has to go back. And she acknowledged that this is kind of an under-examined area of law. And so she kind of sent a call back to say, you have to inform us, et cetera. And at AGF, I co-authored on behalf of AGF, Equal Citizens, and Common Cause an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the Texas case to inform them of all of the things basically I explained to you all tonight and why they should invalidate this law. And so as it stands right now, that law is in place in 7 states. But I see this as a call for public education and popularization of the need to vote by mail, the reliance on it. And I want to bring in Phil Kissling here too, because I see him and I know his leadership around these issues as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I don't have much to add to your great presentation. I just think it's profoundly inequitable that you can say if you're over 60 or 65, you have the right to get one of these ballots, no excuse required. And if you're under that age, these states say you're at risk of criminal prosecution for even asking for one. It's one of the most blatant abridgments of the right to vote. And that word or abridge or the phrase is, I would hope, key to this. And I was helped found the National Vote at Home Institute, and we would love to work with anyone here on efforts going forward to expand that particular method of voting to young people, everybody really. Thanks, Mike.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the next question is, with over 50% of young people now registering independent and many states having closed primaries, do you view the structure of primaries as yet another barrier young voters face, especially since so many candidates and parties do not reach out to mobilize new voters and those voters who are not prime voters?
Absolutely. Young voters, the timing of the primaries and the restrictions with regard to vote by mail for young people, the open questions that, the misinformation and disinformation about the right to vote from a campus domicile while they're on summer, although they obviously, are domiciled and intend to return to campus. These are all institutional problems. And they also have institutional solutions. I really believe that they have institutional solutions if we support organizing and advocacy between young people and elected officials and their allies within the nonprofit community also.
Okay, do we have any other questions? I'm going through the chat just to make sure we didn't miss any.
Clint's got a hand raised there. Clint?
Sure. There's been a lot of restrictions put in place with for both youth voting on campuses. We've looked at a sort of bipartisan path to the 26th Amendment. And, this is a new sort of contemporary era of deep polarization. So I guess I'm getting at what's different. What has changed that is mobilizing so many of these contemporary restrictions on youth and campus voting rights? Why? How do we explain this? Who's doing it?
I think that a lot of this, some of this is intentional and some of this is unintentional, right? Like the polling place question is very much on the local level. Sometimes you have local representatives that are not in favor of bringing polling places on campuses because they have direct animus against youth voters. Sometimes they also haven't thought about the idea of situating a polling place on campus. And so I see this as an opportunity because in some cases it is unintentional. And what I found through the on-campus polling place effort, advocacy, organizing, and litigation, depending on the context, is that there's actually a range of reasons to support it, including and also beyond from a youth voting rights perspective. Like our college institutions generally are required to be ADA accessible and are often more ADA accessible than the off-campus locations. They also have more facilitation for, bringing people off campus and parking and, all of and in light of COVID, larger facilities that can host, et cetera. And so some of this is, and I'll just as a footnote, I was really impressed by the ways in which the disability rights community started to do parallel advocacy for youth voting rights because they saw the natural connection on this on-campus polling location piece. They actually independently organized a press conference around a case that we were involved in on behalf of Bard College, and then invited us to the press conference because they understood it intuitively in terms of this was a disability justice issue, not just a youth voting issue. So some of these are intentional, and we see that with this spate of new and unprecedented state legislative efforts that have been passing. But also there's these kind of unique opportunities that it's not always that there's a bad actor. And oftentimes there's so much popular support and will that it's just a matter of creating a streamline to put everyone in place and to set up the system to allow for it to kind of happen organically. These institutions of higher education, they're civic actors, and they take their missions seriously. And sometimes it's just, because the 26th Amendment is so under-examined and under-considered, there are ways, like for example, the provisional ballot, another reason why they're dropped off. At AGF, we've been working with folks in North Carolina, and we supported student researchers actually. And what the student researchers found by researching, what's happening among their peers as a pedagogical tool, is that the question about whether or not they fill out the voter registration form properly with the proper college address, right? Because there's a question about your mailing address and also of where you live, your dorm address. And there's oftentimes confusion between the two, and the voter reg forms will be easily rejected because because this form was not filled out correctly. But we know that the tools are in place. We know that we can prove where the students properly live, right? The institutions can do that. So it's possible to put systems in place to prevent this arbitrary rejection and systemic issue. And in that case, the county clerk is actually a pro-youth friendly, a pro-voter friendly clerk. So it's just a matter about not really researching the data and the impact of administration, in addition to pushing back against the larger trends of intentional youth voter suppression. There's also this question about getting folks aligned and being able to set up the system to identify and spot where the problems are.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is David. What happened at the Supreme Court in Texas case of 65 and under?
The Supreme Court didn't, hi David, Supreme Court didn't take on the case. They basically said, let it stand. I think it was, my recollection, it was let the procedural issue continue to go, let the case continue to move forward, and just wouldn't take on the question directly head on.
So it's 65 and down, they can't get them then. It stands.
Stands. As of right now, it stands. And that's for Texas and Indiana and 5 other states. There was no decision on it, right? The Supreme Court didn't author There was no major decision. It was just, it wasn't taken on a procedural question, if I recall correctly. But my recollection is very clear that there was no actual deliberation of a decision that was authored or issued. So as of right now, in the Fifth Circuit, for example, they do contemplate that, as I said earlier, that the 26th Amendment does not include access to vote by mail, and that vote by mail is not contemplated within the right to vote. So that's the law of the land as of right now for at least the Fifth Circuit, not nationally, but at least with regard to the Fifth Circuit. And the other states that have these restrictions in place.
So it seems somebody could take a cause of action and force the hand of the Supreme Court.
Yes, this is my fellow troublemaker, David Goodman, my good troublemaker. Yeah, it's possible. I think it depends, because the 26th Amendment is such an under litigated area. What the courts are doing is they're grappling with what the right provides and what it means. And in the Florida case, it was very clear because the Secretary of State said your outright ban on the availability of on-campus polling locations during the early voting period is so obviously a violation of the 26th Amendment. And so there we built good law. And I think we have to be really careful with the current makeup of the federal bench and the circuits that we're litigating in, et cetera, because the courts are still grappling. I wrote a piece of legal scholarship on this. The courts are still grappling with what standard of review to apply to 26th Amendment claims. So we have to teach them as they go about the 14th Amendment history that should inform it, the Voting Rights Act history. I mean, this is very important because otherwise they'll only allow for a relief when it comes to obvious intentional discrimination. So we are when I say the future of the amendment is unwritten, I really mean that. We are still working on a project of informing the courts about what 26th Amendment violations look like and what standard of review to apply to them more robustly, while training students and other people to be watchdogs for 26th Amendment violations.
Actually, I would just add that one lesson for me of the 26th Amendment and how it came about was because states and territories with different voting ages. And so it was this welter of differences across the different states. And one of the pushes was to have a uniform national voting age, right? So that your right to vote doesn't change because you move from one state to the other state. And I just think that's just one of the things that it would be nice, obviously, to have uniform, voter registration requirements, uniform processes, because especially living abroad, we have people who are voting from abroad in all these different states. And everyone is different. Even counties are different. And it's really makes voting just so much more challenging in the United States than elsewhere, like New Zealand.
Okay, we do have another question in the chat. Can we bring a case in another circuit and potentially get the Supreme Court eventually to address it directly?
Again, I think the question is what Supreme Court, especially in light of the decision that came out, 48 hours ago or so, with regard to Roe v. Wade, at least the leaked decision. What Supreme Court do we feel, even the court that passed on Shelby, right? It was a clear indication if they're ready to take away voting rights, that all other rights are on the line. And this leaked decision is ahistorical and illegal. And so this is a larger question. And I know that we have a lot of folks that have built and been involved in social justice movement building and, behind, statewide election administration systems, and also all of the other congressional acts and efforts that had to come around during the second Reconstruction. And so this is where we are right now. So I think we have to support organizing, we have to support advocacy, and of course we have to bring litigation, but we have to be careful about how we bring the litigation and to be strategic about it as well.
Thanks so much for that,
Okay.
Yael, and for both Yael and Jennifer for being with us, and for all of you for spending your Wednesday evening with us. I want to make sure we're respecting the time we asked of you. We'll really quickly, from the people, let you know. So this was one of our Citizen Engagement Forum events. This is an ongoing series that we do basically as we have issues related to our democracy and our election systems, and those things are so incredibly important to us. Put together these amazing panels like you saw tonight. And then we also have a library of those past conversations recorded. I am sharing in the chat with you our calendar to keep an eye on that. Stay tuned for what we have to come. Also an opportunity to get involved if you'd like to be a part of creating those events within our voting rights committee here at the People. Thanks also to Camille Herron for moderating for us tonight. And again, for all of you for spending some time talking about an incredibly important topic. I hope it inspires us all to get all of our young people out to vote. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you.